Hey everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be presenting this research at the workshop. So today I will give an overview of topological neural networks, which in many ways can be seen as extensions of graph neural networks. So in this talk, we're going to see what topological neural networks can do for neuroscience, what are existing topological neural networks out there in the literature, how we can summarize the literature in this table that you see on the right of the slide. In this table, each diagram represents a topological neural networks. And then we'll see how all of these topological neural networks compare with each other and what are the available packages that you can use to implement them and use them. Okay, so topological neural networks extract knowledge from data by exploiting relations between components of a system. So in neuroscience, relations between components of a system could be first structural relations. So that's what's illustrated here, which is an illustration of neurons related with each other with synapses. And so here, the components will be the neurons and the relations will be the structural relations between these neurons. But the relations could also be chemical relations. For example, relationships between drugs, which is illustrated in this graph here. And relations could be also functional relations, which is illustrated with this functional connectome here, while the components here would be brain areas. And the relations between these brain areas would be whether two brain areas tend to activate together, are correlated. So topological neural networks are the goal of topological neural networks is to extract knowledge from data by exploiting such relations between components of the systems. This allows them to answer questions such as, is this neuron inhibitory or excitatory? And that will be making a node level prediction because in this system, the neurons are nodes. Answering questions such as, does fluoxetine interact with venlafaxine? Here, that will be making an edge level prediction because in this system, the nodes, the components are the drugs, and the relationship, the edges, are interaction between drugs. So if we want to predict an interaction, we want to predict whether there is an edge or the strength of the edge, for example. And lastly, we could ask questions such as, what is the brain state associated with this connectome? Is it a resting state? Is it a sleeping state? And that will be making a system level prediction because it's the prediction associated with the whole system, which in that case is the functional connectome. So this seems to be questions that graph neural networks could answer too. Graph neural networks can make node level predictions, edge levels predictions, or system level predictions. So what is the novelty with topological neural networks? The novelty is that topological neural networks extend graph neural networks in the way they answer these questions because they leverage what we call non-binary relationships between the components of the system. And that allowed them to give better answers and to answer more questions. So, for example, if we want to think how topological neural networks, I'm going to call them TNNs now, can give better answers by leveraging non-binary relationship. Instead of just looking at binary relationships between components, meaning only looking at edges that exist between any pair of two nodes, it's going to see how many nodes interact together. So maybe it's going to draw what we could call the hyperedge, meaning an edge that has several nodes inside it, which I have circled here in black. And from the correlations between all the nodes within that hyperedge, we can make a system level prediction that is has better accuracy than what could be done with a graph neural network. And second, they can answer more questions. So again, taking several nodes, not only two, not only pairs of nodes, but like here, 4 nodes, we could ask whether there is a hyperedge around these 4 nodes. Hyperedge, again, being an edge that can have more than 2 nodes here, 4 nodes. And we could predict what's the strength of that hyperedge. For example, that will be answering the question, what is the interaction resulting from taking these 4 drugs together? Because binary relationships here are clearly limited. They can tell you whether these 2 drugs interact, whether these 2 drugs interact. But what about if you take 4 drugs together? Will they interact? or will their interaction be canceled somehow? So topological neural networks will leverage non-binary relationships to give better answers and answer more questions. Okay, so we just said that CNNs extend GNN. So how does this work? Let's consider a graph neural network, a message passing graph neural network. The architecture of a graph neural network is what's on the screen. It's built of several layers. Here we see 2 layers. And these layers process a graph given as input. So that will be the data here. The graph as input is a labeled graph in the sense that there is a graph structure made of nodes and edges connecting nodes, but it also has labels of features. A feature on the node, a feature on the edge. And through each layer, these features on nodes and edges will be processed in order to make a prediction, that is, a vector at the end. So the graph structure often does not change. You see the same graph on every layer, but the features that are associated to each node and edge change. So you can see here this feature is different from the original feature that was on that same node. How do these features change? Through a process called message passing, whose interpretation is that the feature on this node, the new feature on this node, is going to be built from the features that of the nodes that are the neighbors of the nodes we're interested in. And it's made from features of its neighbors. And so we imagine that the neighbors send messages through the node that we're interested in. So at a very high level, that's the graph neural network. Now, topological neural network extend graph neural network, and they are built in the exact same way, except that now nodes can be connected in more than pairs. So here you can see, for example, these 3 nodes are now connected with this cell in pink. But otherwise, the overall idea is the same. The nodes exchange messages with their neighbors. Just now, the notion of neighbor is a bit different. Okay, why do we need a literature review of these TNNs? It's because there are several confusions, and the first one will be that there used to be a confusion between TDA and TDL. So TDA for topological data analysis, and TDL for topological deep learning, which is the field of topological neural networks. And even though TDA has been used in machine learning and deep learning, very often TDA does not consider topological neural networks. It will, most of the time, extract topological features and then use this feature to inform existing neural network architectures. By contrast, topological deep learning builds the topological neural networks or the message passing topological neural networks that I was just mentioning. And the second confusion that there was is that this literature is growing. This literature on topological neural network is growing. Yet the notation is very mathematical, and very often there was no unification of this notation. So these are all equations that were taken from different papers, and they all mean the same thing, but you can see that they're written in very different ways. So for this talk, we're going to do 2 things. First, we're going to see the graphical framework that will allow us to summarize the literature, how we define the pictograms that allow us to represent these topological neural networks, and then we're going to survey the literature using the pictograms. In the graphical framework, 2 subsection, what is a topological domain and how this gives rise to many different topological neural networks, and what is the message passing mechanism. Okay, starting with the framework and per subsection topological domain. This figure summarizes the traditional discrete domains on which traditional neural networks are built, and then the domains of topological deep learning. So in the traditional discrete domains, you start with a set, which is a system of components that have no relationships with each other. And then the graph, a system of components that have only pairwise or binary relationship with each other. And these relations are called the edges. And these can be generalized in at least 4 different ways in topological deep learnings. The simplicial complex, where you can draw faces between nodes, but these faces are restricted to be triangle. And you can also draw volumes, but these volumes will be restricted to be tetrahedrons. Then you have the cellular complex, which now you can build faces and volumes, but they're not restricted to be triangles or tetraedrons. On the very right here, you have the hypergraph, where you can join several nodes to build hyperedges, which are just like edges, but they can have several nodes in them. And you can see they don't have different shades of pink because there is no notion of dimension here. Whereas in the simplicial and cellular complexes, edges have dimension 1, faces dimension 2, volumes dimension 3, etc. And this is pictured by these darker shades of red. And then in the intersection of them all, there is the combinatorial complex that kind of merges both mechanisms. Examples of topological domains will be for the simplicial complex, um, a molecule where you have this cyclopropane that can link 3 atoms. But the cellular complex is more interesting for this application because you can have molecules that forms rings. So for example, the benzene rings, which are several nodes having weak interaction with each other and forming benzene rings. And this ring does not need to be a triangle. On the right, the hypergraph, which is our drug interaction graph. Now we have a hyperedge that links several nodes if it is known that these 4 proteins or these 4 drugs interact with each other. And for example, it's interesting here, you can see that protein A and G would not interact with each other, but if they are put with B and F, then there is an interaction. And then in the middle, you have the combinatorial complex that kind of merges all of these ideas. So that's the choice of topological domain, how we can extend beyond the graph domain by just adding more complicated relationships between the components of a system. Then there is the mechanism, how these components, these nodes, are going to pass messages between each other to define what's a layer in the topological neural networks. First, we need to decide which cell sends messages to which cell. So I'm not using nodes anymore, I'm using cell to talk about either a node, an edge, a face, and then any cell of rank R. So this is what's shown here with the legend. And that's because in this topological neural network, not only nodes can pass messages with each other, between each other, but also edge can send a message to an edge. Or here, an edge sends a message to a node. Here would be an example where an edge sends a message to an edge, and here where a node sends a message to a node. So that is the first type of pictogram that we will see. If you see a pictogram like this, meaning 2 rounds and an arrow between them, it means all of the edges represented by this one pink node are sending message to all of the nodes. Actually, not all of them, only the ones they are connected to. So the message passing can be broken down in 4 steps. So what is the message? And who sends message to who? In the graphical literature review that's going to follow, you're going to see that we draw 3 types of arrows, either a black arrow or a red arrow or a bold black arrow. This is going to represent what is the type of message passing. So you can see that nodes send messages to nodes through a neighborhood structure called the Laplacian, and here would be a convolutional type of message because the arrow is black. Here, it will be a convolutional message with an attention mechanism where edges send messages to edges if they're connected by a down adjacency. It's a type of neighborhood structure. And here, it will be a very general message passing whereby nodes send messages to edges. And by the way, the classical graph convolutional network will be represented like this. Nodes send message to nodes, but only to nodes that are their neighbors, and their neighbors is represented by this adjacency matrix. Then we have 2 other steps in the message passing mechanism, meaning when all messages arrive at one cell, how do these cells aggregate these messages? And this can be separated into intra-neighborhood aggregation and inter-neighborhood aggregation. Yes, because, for example, here, you could see that edges would receive messages either from other edges, via this A, or from node, via this B. And so first, for all the edges that receive messages from other edges, they would need to aggregate these messages, it's intra-neighborhood aggregation. And then so once you have aggregated all the messages coming from this arrow, and then all the messages coming from that arrow, you need to do a meta-aggregation, which will be the inter-neighborhood aggregation. and then you update the feature on the node. So for example, this will be one of the pictograms that you're going to see in the literature review that I'm about to show you. This is a pictogram representing message passing simplicial network. So how could we think about that pictogram? Well, we see that node, edges, and faces all send messages to edges. Nodes send messages to edges. Edges send messages to edges in two different ways, meaning through two different notion of neighborhoods. And then faces also send messages to edges. Then all of these messages get aggregated with a sum, and then an update function is applied, and then the process repeats. All right, now we are about to see a survey of the whole literature, whose goal is to explain how we go from the graph convolutional network, which would be represented by this simpler pictogram. So in this table, the rows represent the topological domains. You recognize hypergraph, simplicial, cellular, and combinatorial. And then the columns represent the type of message passing, either standard convolutional, which will be just a simple black arrow, or with attention, or just very, very general, which would be either a bold arrow or a red arrow. Okay, so we're going to fill each one of these boxes with diagrams that represent each paper's topological neural network. Okay, so these are the hypergraph neural networks represented as tensor diagrams. So the hypergraph neural networks are the oldest neural networks from this field, with the first one published in 2020. I think it's, yeah, this one. Before that, there was deep learning on hypergraphs, but the process was overall the same. First, the hypergraph was collapsed to a graph, and then the graph neural network was used. But this was collapsing important structure. So this is why starting 2020, hypergraph neural networks that are native to the hypergraph domain were built. And you can see that most of these hypergraph neural networks are built with the same idea, meaning that each tensor diagram, which is our pictogram representation, looks like a blue, pink, and then a blue, meaning nodes send messages to edges or hyper edges, and then hyper edges send messages to nodes. Also, we can see that the hypergraph community has done a really good job at generalizing models from the graph neural networks to the hypergraph domain. So one example of this will be this one, which is uni-GCN2, and it generalizes, well, GCN2, which is a graph neural network. And this is also a very interesting neural network because it addresses the problem of oversmoothing, which is a problem that is known in graph neural network, but that also happens in topological neural network, which is the tendency of the node features to become more similar as we increase the neural network's depth. And so that limits the depth that neural network can have. And so these hypergraph neural networks in uni-GCN2 have applied the same strategy that was used in GCN2 for graph to address this oversmoothing problem. Then we have this one, which is all set, which generalizes transformers. So you can see the arrows are red, signifying attention. Generalizes transformers to hypergraph. And so that's another very important successful aspect of graph neural network that was brought to the hypergraph domain. Then we get topological deep learning on simplicial complex domain. And the first on this domain is SNN from 2020. And you can notice that this neural network looks a lot like the graph convolutional neural network that I have here. It's basically the same thing, except in graph neural network, nodes can send messages to nodes. And here, that process is repeated for the edges that can send messages to edges in pink. And then the faces can send messages to faces. So, and similarly here, same idea, except cells can have any rank. So volumes can send messages to volumes. Cells of dimension more than 4 can send messages more than 4. And so it's only Bunch that came up with this simplicial neural network not so long after, which unlike the first two simplicial neural network we just saw, now cells can send messages across different ranks, nodes to edges, faces to edges, etc. Still in dust one, the maximal dimension is 2 for the faces. I also like to mention this one, which includes a message passing scheme that is also more complicated in the sense that there are 2 levels now. nodes sending message to nodes and edges, and then these node and edges sending message back to the nodes. So we can get as complicated as we want. And this one also several layers, actually one, two, three, four, several levels. Yeah. This one is also interesting, again, using a red arrow for the attention neural network, and that's the only topological neural network that will work for heterogeneous data, meaning the features assigned on different cells, nodes, edges, faces, can have different dimensions. But beside this neural network, it hasn't been done in the topological neural network community at the time of this review. Next, we have the cellular case, which have much less topological neural network than the other. It's interesting though, because we can see that most of the structures that have been proposed, or most of the topological neural network that have been proposed, mirror existing topological neural networks in the simplicial domain. So for example, this one is a cellular complex generalization of the simplicial one. Likewise, these ones are also quite similar, or these ones. And lastly, in the combinatorial domain case, not only the topological domain is complicated, but the combinatorial neural network that have been built on them also look fairly complicated with different levels per layer. Each pictogram on this figure represents one layer. So a fair question to ask when we see all of this is, how do these models compare? And in order to answer this question, we can first open each paper that presented the topological neural network and see what type of experiments they've done. And so we can see that in green, half of them have compared their proposed TNN to a GNN, and generally it outperformed the corresponding GNN. So a hypergraph neural network will outperform a graph neural network. And also in blue, they often compare themselves to other TNNs of the same domain. So this, for example, this line, which is a hypergraph neural network, will perform better than the hypergraph neural networks that came before it. But there is no across-domain comparison. In the hypergraph neural network literature, they won't compare themselves to simplicial complex literature. And so if we want to answer the question, how do these models compare across domains? We need a special benchmark tool. And so that was the goal of these two open sourced software. On the left, it's a suite called TopoX, which implements the topological neural network that I just presented. And on the right, TopoBench, which is a benchmarking suite that allows to compare these topological neural networks. And so how do they compare? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on the data sets. It depends on the task. And so if you're interested in knowing more, we invite you to look at the code or look at these papers. And then last question to answer before I wrap up. How can you build new topological neural networks? Maybe you have a favorite graph neural network and you're wondering whether you could turn this idea into a topological neural network, because at least topological neural network often outperform graph neural network. And so if you're interested in that, we recently put a preprint allowing you to do just this. Basically, cracking open a topological neural network and realizing that it can be represented as a set of graph neural networks. So for example, if I have a topological neural network where nodes and messages to nodes, edges to edges, and faces to edges, I can crack open this topological domain and instead represent it as three graphs, and then run graph neural networks on each of these three graphs, and then recombine in a clever way. And so in this way, you would have both code and a general methodology to take something you like from the graph neural network community and make it topological. And please let us know what you find. That's it. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my collaborators here, in particular Mathilde Papillon, first author on many of these papers, and also the author sites. Thank you.